The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the pristine VIP lounge of Atlantic Airways. Jack Miller adjusted his security badge, scanning the room with practiced efficiency. His pressed uniform and rigid posture reflected his 15 years of service. At the security desk, his colleague Tom leaned back in his chair, scrolling through his phone. "Did you see what happened in Terminal B yesterday?" Tom snickered, showing Jack a video. "Some guy tried to use his cousin's first-class ticket. These people never learn." Jack shook his head, a tight smile on his face. "That's why we're here. Can't let anyone slip through." He'd built his reputation on spotting trouble before it started. The morning briefing had emphasized heightened security due to a VIP board meeting, though the details remained confidential. 2 more security officers joined them, bringing coffee. "Another day in paradise," Sarah remarked, setting down her cup. "At least we don't work regular security. Dealing with those economy passengers all day? No thanks." The group shared knowing looks and continued their morning banter, dropping casual comments about certain types of passengers who didn't belong in their exclusive space. Jack participated with short nods, focusing instead on monitoring the entrance. At 9:45 a.m., a man in jeans and a casual button-down shirt walked into the lounge. David Brooks moved with quiet confidence, his messenger bag slung across his shoulder. He headed straight for the premium seating area, acknowledging the hostess with a warm smile. Jack straightened, his attention locked on David. The man's casual attire stood out among the suits and designer clothes of typical VIP passengers. He watched as David settled into a leather armchair and pulled out a laptop. "You seeing this?" Jack muttered to Tom. "No boarding pass check, straight to the restricted section." Tom glanced up briefly. "Probably another wannabe influencer trying to snag photos for social media. Better check it out." Jack approached David, his steps measured and purposeful. The morning's jokes and prejudices fueled his certainty that this man didn't belong. "Sir, I need to see your boarding pass and membership credentials." David looked up, maintaining eye contact. "Of course. Let me just—" "Sir, please step away from the seating area while you locate your documents." Jack's tone carried an edge of authority that drew attention from nearby passengers. "That won't be necessary. I have them right here." David reached for his bag, but Jack had already gripped his arm. "I'm going to have to ask you to come with me." Jack's fingers dug into David's bicep as he pulled him up from the chair. "We don't tolerate unauthorized access." The lounge fell silent. Business travelers lowered their newspapers. A woman gasped as Jack forcefully steered David toward the exit, ignoring his calm protests. "There's been a misunderstanding," David stated firmly, but Jack continued pushing him forward. "There's no misunderstanding, sir. This is a restricted area for authorized passengers only." Jack's voice carried across the now silent lounge, his certainty masking the adrenaline coursing through him. Phones emerged from pockets and purses, recording the scene as Jack manhandled David through the lounge's elegant entrance. The morning's casual prejudices had escalated into a public spectacle, though Jack remained convinced he was simply doing his job. Little did he know, security cameras captured every second of his interaction with David Brooks, the majority shareholder and owner of Atlantic Airways, who had chosen that morning to conduct an impromptu inspection of his company's premium services. The video spread like wildfire across social media platforms. Shaky smartphone footage showed Jack Miller dragging David Brooks from the lounge, with captions detailing the shocking revelation. Airline owner racially profiled in his own VIP lounge. Within hours, the clip had millions of views. News anchors picked up the story, their polished voices adding gravity to the situation. In a disturbing incident at Kennedy International Airport, David Brooks, the owner of Atlantic Airways, was forcibly removed from his company's exclusive lounge by security officer Jack Miller. The incident has sparked outrage and renewed discussions about racial profiling in the aviation industry. hashtag #Justice for David trended nationwide, accompanied by thousands of similar stories from travelers of color. Corporate communications at Atlantic Airways worked overtime, fielding calls from major news outlets and managing the crisis that threatened to devastate the airline's reputation. In his modest Brooklyn apartment, David sat at his kitchen table, memories flooding back as his phone continued buzzing with notifications. The worn photograph in his hands showed a younger version of himself with his grandmother, Margaret Brooks, standing proud in her nurse's uniform. 1985? Harlem, David whispered, running his finger along the photo's edge. His mind drifted to a conversation from his childhood, one that had shaped his entire future. "Baby," Margaret had told him, her hands rough from years of work, but gentle as they held his face. "Don't you ever let anyone tell you where you belong. Your daddy didn't build his business by asking permission to take up space." Young David, just 10 years old, had been crying after being followed around a department store by security. "But Grandma, they always think I'm doing something wrong." "Then prove them wrong. Not with anger, but with success. Own the store if you have to." She'd smiled, wiping his tears. "You're going to face people who want to put you in a box. Your job is to build something so big they can't ignore you." The memory sharpened as David's phone lit up with another call from his PR team. He'd taken his grandmother's words to heart, working his way through business school, starting in aviation logistics, and eventually acquiring enough shares to become the majority owner of Atlantic Airways. Now, decades later, he found himself facing the same prejudices he'd fought his entire life. Across town, Jack Miller sat in his living room, staring at his own phone. His daughter's message glared back at him. "Dad, please tell me that's not you in the video. Everyone at school is talking about it. How could you do that to someone?" The weight of his actions pressed down on him. His daughter's disappointment cut deeper than the mounting public criticism. Jack had always seen himself as one of the good ones, a professional doing his job. But now, watching the video for the 100th time, he saw what everyone else saw. His assumptions, his aggression, his unquestioned prejudice played out in high definition. His hands shook as he typed and deleted multiple responses to his daughter. The uncomfortable truth was that he had no explanation that wouldn't sound like an excuse. The man he'd manhandled had been calm, well-spoken, and entirely within his rights. Jack had acted on ingrained biases he'd never acknowledged, much less confronted. The television droned in the background, analysts dissecting the incident from every angle. Jack's union representative had already called, discussing potential disciplinary actions and suggesting he lay low until the media storm passed. But as night fell over the city, Jack Miller realized that laying low wouldn't erase what the incident had revealed, not to the world and not to himself. The same video played on screens across the country, forcing uncomfortable conversations about privilege, prejudice, and power. For David Brooks, it was another battle in a long war. For Jack Miller, it was the beginning of an uncomfortable awakening. And for both men, tomorrow would bring challenges neither was fully prepared to face. The Atlantic Airways corporate headquarters buzzed with activity as staff prepared for David Brooks's press conference. Security had been doubled, and news vans lined the street outside. Inside the main conference room, David adjusted his tie, ignoring his PR team's last-minute coaching. "Mr. Brooks, remember to stick to the prepared statement," Sarah Chen, his head of communications, advised. "We need to handle this carefully to minimize damage to the company's stock price." David set the notes aside. "I'm not here to protect stock prices, Sarah. This is bigger than that." He straightened his shoulders, remembering every time he'd been followed in stores, every cab that had passed him by, every suspicious glance at his first-class boarding pass. The press conference began precisely at 10 a.m. Camera flashes erupted as David approached the podium, his expression composed but determined. The room fell silent as he gripped the sides of the lectern. "Good morning. I'm here today not just as the owner of Atlantic Airways, but as someone who has experienced what millions of others face daily. What happened in that lounge wasn't an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a deeper problem in our society, one that persists even when you own the building you're standing in." He continued, his voice steady as he shared statistics about discrimination in the aviation industry. Last year alone, there were over 5,000 reported incidents of racial profiling at airports across the country. Behind each of those numbers is a person who was made to feel less than human. Across town, Jack Miller sat in the break room of the airport security office, watching the press conference on a small TV with his colleagues. The room that had once felt comfortable now seemed hostile. His co-workers, who days ago had laughed at his jokes, now kept their distance. "Man, you really stepped in at this time," muttered Mike, a fellow officer who had worked with Jack for years. "Should have checked his ID first." "Like you wouldn't have done the same thing," Jack shot back, immediately regretting his defensive tone. "Don't drag us into your mess," another officer called out. "We're not the ones trending on Twitter." Jack left the break room, seeking refuge in the empty locker area. His phone buzzed with another message from his union representative, warning him about potential disciplinary action. The job he'd been proud of for 15 years now felt like a prison sentence. Back at the press conference, David fielded questions from reporters. "No, I'm not calling for anyone's termination," he stated firmly. "What I want is change. Real, lasting change. Starting today, Atlantic Airways will be launching a comprehensive review of our security protocols and implementing mandatory anti-bias training for all employees." The announcement triggered another burst of camera flashes. David continued, "We're also establishing a passenger advocacy board to address discrimination complaints and create guidelines for respectful treatment of all customers." Social media exploded with reactions. Some praised David's measured response, while others demanded harsher consequences for Jack and the airline. Boycott Atlantic competed with Mal Brooks for change in the trending topics. As David concluded the press conference, he added one final unscripted comment. To Officer Miller, "Your actions hurt me, but they've also given us an opportunity. An opportunity to show that change is possible, that we can do better. The question is, are we brave enough to try?" The words hit Jack like a physical blow as he watched on his phone. His last shred of self-justification crumbled. What had started as a routine morning had transformed into a mirror, reflecting back years of unexamined biases and casual prejudices. David's words echoed across social media platforms and news channels, transforming a moment of discrimination into a national conversation about change. For Jack, isolated and increasingly desperate, the path forward seemed unclear. But for David, standing strong under the glare of camera lights, this was just the beginning of a larger battle for recognition and respect in spaces that should have been his all along. The convention center hummed with anticipation as crowds gathered for David Brooks's follow-up press conference. Security guards checked credentials at every entrance, their movements careful and deliberate after the recent controversy. Jack Miller stood across the street, his security uniform replaced by civilian clothes, watching people file into the building. His hands were sweaty as he gripped the visitor's pass he'd obtained through a former colleague. The past week had been a blur of administrative leave meetings, mandatory counseling sessions, and increasingly urgent calls from his union representative. But something had drawn him here, beyond explanation or reason. "You don't have to do this," his daughter had told him that morning, watching him pace their kitchen. "Just release a statement through the union." But statements felt hollow now. Jack had spent nights re-watching the video, seeing himself through others' eyes. The certainty in his movements, the casual cruelty of his assumptions, it was all there in high definition, impossible to ignore. Inside the convention center, David Brooks reviewed his notes one final time. The room was packed with journalists, industry representatives, and civil rights activists. This press conference would outline Atlantic Airways' new inclusion initiatives, but David sensed something else brewing. His security team had informed him of Jack Miller's presence outside. "We should have him removed," his head of security suggested, the irony of the statement lost on no one. "No," David replied firmly. "Let him in if he wants to come in." Jack moved through the crowd, feeling eyes on him as people began to recognize his face from the viral video. Whispers followed him. Someone took a photo. His instinct was to flee, but he forced himself forward, finding a spot near the back of the room. David approached the podium, his presence commanding immediate attention. As he began outlining the company's new initiatives, his eyes scanned the crowd and locked onto Jack's. A moment of recognition passed between them. "Before we continue," David said, departing from his prepared remarks, "I see Officer Miller has joined us today." The room erupted in murmurs as hundreds of heads turned toward Jack. "Would you like to come up here, Officer Miller?" The invitation hung in the air like a physical thing. Jack felt his legs move before his brain could process what was happening. The crowd parted, some people stepping back as if his presence might contaminate them. Each step toward the stage felt like walking through deep water. "Get out!" someone shouted from the crowd. Others joined in, their voices building into a wave of hostility. Jack stopped halfway to the stage, his face burning with shame and fear. David raised his hands for silence. "Please, this is exactly the moment we need to face." His voice carried authority that quieted the room. "Officer Miller, please join me." Jack completed his journey to the stage, his uniform training warring with his instinct to run. As he reached the podium, David extended his hand. The gesture, simple yet profound, was captured by dozens of cameras. Jack began, his voice cracking. The microphone amplified his uncertainty to the entire room. He had prepared words, practiced speeches, but facing the man he had wronged, everything fell away. The crowd's tension was palpable. Some held phones high, recording what might become either a moment of reconciliation or another viral disaster. Others stood with arms crossed, skepticism evident in their postures. David maintained his position, hands still extended, as Jack struggled to find his voice. The seconds stretched into an unbearable silence, broken only by the rapid-fire clicks of press cameras. Everything that had led to this moment, the viral video, the public outrage, the private shame, seemed to converge in this single, stretched instant of possibility and dread. The silence in the convention center shattered as Jack finally grasped David's extended hand. His grip was shaky, his other hand gripping the podium for support. The crowd's reaction was immediate, a mix of gasps, mutters, and the constant click of cameras. "I don't deserve to be up here," Jack began, his voice trembling into the microphone. More shouts erupted from the audience, some agreeing with him, others demanding he leave. The pressure built until something inside Jack broke. Years of carefully maintained professional distance crumbled. "You're right," he shouted over the noise, tears now visible in his eyes. "You're all right. I did exactly what you think I did. I saw a black man in casual clothes in a space I decided he couldn't belong in, and I didn't even consider..." His voice cracked. "I didn't consider I could be wrong. I didn't consider anything except what I'd already decided was true." The room fell silent, caught off guard by the raw emotion in his voice. David stood beside him, his hand now resting on the podium, watching intently as Jack continued. "I've spent 20 years telling myself I was one of the good ones, that I treated everyone the same. But when I watched that video, when I saw myself..." Jack paused, wiping his eyes roughly with his sleeve. "I saw every assumption, every prejudice I claimed I didn't have. Right there in how I moved, how I spoke, How I didn't even give Mr. Brooks a chance to explain. Someone in the audience called out, "You're just sorry you got caught." "Yes," Jack responded immediately, surprising everyone. "Yes, I am sorry I got caught. Because if I hadn't been caught, I would still be telling myself lies about who I am and how I treat people. My daughter wouldn't have had to see her father for who he really was. I wouldn't have had to face myself." David stepped forward then, moving to the microphone. "What we're witnessing right now is important," he said, his calm voice a contrast to Jack's emotional display. "This is what change looks like. It's messy, it's uncomfortable, it's painful, but it's necessary." Turning to Jack, David continued, "Officer Miller, your actions that day hurt me. They brought back every slight, every discrimination I've faced. But your presence here today, your willingness to face this publicly, that shows something else." Jack stood straighter, fighting to regain his composure as David addressed him directly. "I'm proposing something unexpected," David announced. "Officer Miller, I want you to help us create our new sensitivity training program. Not as a symbol of shame, but as someone who understands exactly how these biases work and why they need to change." The announcement sent shockwaves through the room. Jack stared at David in disbelief, while reporters rushed to capture the moment on their phones. "Your experience, your perspective, your journey, it could help others recognize their own biases before they act on them," David explained. "This isn't about forgiveness, it's about transformation." Jack nodded slowly, tears still streaming down his face. "I don't deserve this chance," he managed to say. "This isn't about what you deserve," David replied firmly. "It's about what we can build together. Will you help us?" The room held its breath as Jack straightened his shoulders, years of security training visible in his posture, even as his voice shook with emotion. "Yes, sir, I will." The moment transformed the press conference from a PR event into something more profound, a real-time demonstration of accountability, vulnerability, and the possibility of change. As David and Jack shook hands again, flashbulbs captured what would become an iconic image of reconciliation and the beginning of a challenging journey toward genuine transformation. The Atlantic Airways corporate boardroom felt alien to Jack as he sat through his first diversity initiative meeting. Gone was his security uniform, replaced by a business casual outfit that still made him feel like an imposter. Around the polished mahogany table, executives eyed him with varying degrees of skepticism. "Mr. Miller," said Richard Thompson, VP of Operations, his tone dripping with disdain, "perhaps you could share your unique perspective on our current security protocols?" The emphasis on unique made several board members shift uncomfortably in their leather chairs. Jack cleared his throat, fighting the urge to shrink from the hostile attention. "Our current protocols leave too much room for personal bias," he stated, his voice growing stronger as he continued. "We rely heavily on individual judgment calls, which is where prejudices can interfere with proper assessment." "Are you suggesting we eliminate security personnel's ability to make judgment calls?" Thompson challenged, leaning forward aggressively. "No," David Brooks interrupted, entering the room. "He's suggesting we give them better tools to make those judgments." His presence immediately altered the room's dynamics, though not everyone looked pleased to see him. Outside the corporate offices, public reaction to David's decision remained divided. The morning's newspaper headlines ranged from "Brooks shows revolutionary leadership" to "Atlantic Airways caves" to "PR pressure." Social media continued to churn with debates about whether Jack deserved his second chance. During lunch breaks, Jack often found himself eating alone in his new office, a far cry from the camaraderie of the security break room. His old colleagues had largely distanced themselves, seeing his new role as betrayal. The few texts he received from them were bitter. "Hope you're enjoying your cushy promotion, traitor." David faced his own challenges. Several board members had privately expressed concerns about the company's direction. "This isn't a social justice organization," one had warned. "We're here to make money, not headlines." But change was already taking root. The first batch of security officers went through the new training program, with Jack sharing his story as a cautionary tale. Some officers sat with arms crossed, resistant to the message, while others engaged thoughtfully with the material. "I used to be you," Jack told them, standing before a room of familiar faces that now viewed him as a stranger. "I thought I was just doing my job, following my instincts, but those instincts were built on prejudices I didn't want to acknowledge." The resistance wasn't limited to security personnel. During one particularly tense meeting, a senior manager openly challenged David's initiatives. "We're spending millions on these programs while our competitors are focusing on efficiency. This crusade of yours is going to tank our stock price." David remained unmoved. "If protecting our stock price means accepting discrimination as business as usual, then we need new shareholders." His statement made headlines, causing a temporary dip in Atlantic Airways stock, but also drawing support from progressive investors. Jack's daughter visited him at work one afternoon, her first time seeing him in his new role. "Dad," she said, looking around his office, "I'm proud of you. But are you okay? You seem different." "I am different," he replied, realizing the truth as he said it. "For the first time in my life, I'm really seeing things, really seeing people. It's harder than I thought it would be." The challenges continued to mount. Anonymous complaints about the new training program filtered in. Some longtime customers threatened to switch airlines, calling the company too woke. Security incidents were scrutinized with unprecedented intensity, with both supporters and critics ready to pounce on any mistake. But amid the resistance, small victories emerged. Customer satisfaction scores began to show improvement. Employee feedback revealed decreased tensions in diverse teams. The training program, though controversial, was starting to show measurable results in reducing complaint rates. As the first month of their partnership drew to a close, both David and Jack understood that they had only begun to scratch the surface of systemic change. The real test of their commitment still lay ahead. Jack stood in his daughter Sarah's doorway, watching her prepare for school. Posters advocating for social justice now decorated her walls, replacing the pop star images that had hung there just months ago. Her laptop displayed a draft of her college application essay titled, "How My Father Taught Me About Change." "You don't have to write about me," Jack said softly, entering the room. Sarah turned in her chair, meeting his eyes. "Dad, do you know how many of my friends' parents just double down when they're wrong? They make excuses. They get defensive. You didn't. You changed." She paused, then added, "You're still changing." The conversation was interrupted by Jack's phone buzzing with notifications. The International Aviation Conference had announced its keynote speakers. David Brooks would address industry leaders about corporate responsibility and racial equity, with Jack scheduled to participate in a panel discussion about security reform. Meanwhile, at Atlantic Airways headquarters, David sat through another round of media interviews. The questions had evolved from the initial incident to broader industry issues, but the pressure remained intense. "Mr. Brooks," a CNN reporter asked, "some critics suggest your focus on social issues is distracting from core business operations. How do you respond?" David leaned forward, his response measured but firm. "Safety and respect aren't distractions from our core business. They are our core business. When passengers board our planes, they trust us with their lives. That trust should extend to their dignity as well." The interview was interrupted by breaking news. A competing airline had just announced record profits, attributing their success to focusing on operations rather than politics. The implied criticism was clear, and David's phone immediately lit up with calls from concerned board members. Later that afternoon, Jack faced his own challenge at a security training seminar. A veteran officer raised his hand during the QA session. "With all due respect, Mr. Miller, aren't we just replacing one form of profiling with another? Now officers are so afraid of being called racist that they might miss real threats." The room tensed, but Jack had anticipated this question. "That's exactly why we're developing clear, objective criteria for security assessments. True safety isn't about gut feelings or assumptions. It's about consistent, fair procedures applied equally to everyone." As he finished speaking, he noticed David standing at the back of the room, nodding in approval. Their eyes met in a moment of mutual understanding. This wasn't just about changing policies, it was about changing mindsets. The day of the aviation conference arrived with unexpected tension. Outside the venue, protesters gathered on both sides, one group supporting Atlantic Airways reforms, another denouncing them as dangerous political correctness. David's keynote speech drew a packed audience. Industry leaders, media personalities, and aviation experts filled the auditorium. As he approached the podium, he spotted Jack in the front row, now comfortable in a business suit, but still carrying himself with a security officer's alertness. "Leadership isn't about being perfect," David began, his voice carrying across the hushed room. "It's about being brave enough to acknowledge our imperfections and committed enough to address them." He gestured to Jack. "Sometimes our greatest lessons come from our most painful mistakes." Jack sat straighter, no longer shrinking from the attention. The shame that had once consumed him had transformed into determination. His daughter's words echoed in his mind. "You're still changing." As David continued his speech, outlining Atlantic Airways' progress and future plans, the atmosphere in the room shifted from skepticism to cautious optimism. The data was undeniable. Complaint rates down, employee satisfaction up, and despite initial stock fluctuations, investor confidence was steadily growing. The email arrived late on a Tuesday evening. An anonymous employee had forwarded a chain of messages from James Whitaker, Atlantic Airways Executive Vice President of Operations, containing years of discriminatory comments and directives. The messages revealed systematic efforts to discourage hiring minorities for senior positions and instructions to maintain traditional client comfort in first-class services. David's phone rang moments after the email leaked. It was Jack. "Have you seen it?" "I'm looking at it now," David replied, scrolling through screenshots of conversations that made his stomach turn. "Whitaker's been with the company for 20 years. He oversees half our domestic operations. He's also the one who's been quietly undermining our new training programs," Jack added. "Security supervisors told me he's been sending unofficial memos suggesting they use discretion in implementing the new protocols." The next morning, Atlantic Airways stock dropped 12 points as news of the leaked emails spread. Atlantic Airways Exposed trended on Twitter, with users sharing screenshots of the most damaging messages. Civil rights organizations called for boycotts, and several corporate clients suspended their business travel contracts. In the executive boardroom, Whitaker sat with his lawyers, his usual confidence replaced by calculated defensiveness. "These messages are taken out of context," he insisted. "I was simply addressing operational efficiency concerns." David and Jack exchanged glances across the conference table. The old Jack might have accepted such excuses. The new Jack recognized them for what they were. "Context?" Jack interrupted, his voice steady. "What's the correct context for suggesting security perform extra screening on passengers with suspicious-sounding names?" Whitaker's lawyer jumped in. "Mr. Miller, given your own history, perhaps you should recuse yourself from these discussions." "My history is exactly why I need to be here," Jack responded. "I know what systemic discrimination looks like because I was part of it. The difference is, I admitted it. I changed." David stood, commanding the room's attention. "We're calling an all-hands meeting. Every employee, every department. This ends now." The company auditorium filled beyond capacity that afternoon. Employees joined via video conference from airports and offices across the country. The tension was palpable as David took the stage, with Jack beside him. Today we discovered that while we've been working to build a better company, others have been actively undermining those efforts, David began. Some of you may think this is just corporate politics. It's not. This is about who we are and what we stand for. Jack stepped forward. When I publicly confronted my biases, many of you wondered if it was just for show. Today, we're asking everyone in this company to do the same thing I did. Look honestly at your actions, your assumptions, and your silence in the face of discrimination. David outlined immediate actions: an independent audit of all hiring and promotion practices, a review of all security protocols, and the establishment of an employee oversight committee with real power to investigate complaints. But most importantly, David continued, we're creating a system where every employee can safely report discrimination without fear of retaliation. The kind of culture that allowed these emails to exist ends today. From his seat in the front row, Whitaker stood up. This witch hunt is going to destroy everything we've built. Our premium customers have expectations. Our only expectation should be respect for every human being who chooses to fly with us. David cut him off. If that's not acceptable to you, there's the door. The auditorium erupted in applause, surprising both David and Jack. Employees began standing, some sharing their own stories of discrimination they'd witnessed or experienced. What had started as a crisis meeting transformed into a watershed moment for corporate culture. As the meeting concluded, David and Jack knew the hardest part still lay ahead. Changing policies was one thing, changing hearts and minds was another. But for the first time, they saw real hope in the faces of their employees. The emergency board meeting convened at dawn. Whitaker arrived with an entourage of lawyers and PR consultants, his demeanor a practiced mix of indignation and manufactured remorse. The boardroom, usually a sanctuary of corporate decorum, crackled with tension. These emails, Whitaker began, standing to address the board, represent informal discussions taken completely out of context. Every decision I made was in the best interest of maintaining our premium service standards. Premium service standards? David's voice cut through the room. Let's be specific, James. You wrote, and I quote, certain demographics make our first-class passengers uncomfortable. Ensure ticketing maintains appropriate passenger mix. The board members shifted uncomfortably as more emails were displayed on the presentation screen. Jack, now sitting among them as head of security reform, watched their reactions carefully. Some seemed genuinely shocked, while others appeared more concerned with the publicity than the content. We're facing a critical decision, David continued. Not just about Mr. Whitaker, but about what Atlantic Airways truly stands for. Whitaker's lead attorney interrupted. My client has decades of experience in aviation. His record of profitability speaks for itself. This witch hunt, led by someone with their own agenda, he gestured toward Jack, threatens to destabilize a successful company. Jack stood slowly, his security training evident in his measured movements. Let's talk about destabilization. Since implementing our new inclusive protocols, customer satisfaction has increased by 28%. Complaint rates are down 40%. Employee retention has improved across all departments. He pulled up his own presentation. These aren't feel-good metrics. This is business performance data. Mr. Whitaker's traditional approach wasn't just discriminatory. It was holding us back. The board's attention shifted as financial projections appeared on screen. Whitaker's face reddened. Those numbers are manipulated. Miller has no experience in corporate finance. The numbers come directly from our financial department, David interjected. The same department you tried to prevent from hiring qualified candidates because their names didn't fit our corporate image. A junior board member, Sarah Chen, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. I was one of those candidates 8 years ago. I had to change my name on my resume to get an interview. Her revelation sent ripples through the room. Whitaker's composure cracked. This company was built on certain values, certain standards. We're not a social experiment. No, David's voice thundered. This company was built on innovation, service, and excellence. You've confused discrimination with standards, bias with tradition. The board called for a vote. Whitaker's supporters tried to delay, citing procedural concerns, but the momentum had shifted. As the votes were tallied, Jack watched the man who had once seemed untouchable begin to crumble. Effective immediately, the board chairman announced, James Whitaker is terminated from his position at Atlantic Airways. Furthermore, the board approves a full investigation into all hiring and promotion decisions made under his leadership. As security escorted Whitaker from the building, he pointed at Jack. You're destroying everything we built. This company will regret listening to a glorified security guard. No, Jack replied calmly. We're building something better. Something real. The news broke within hours. Atlantic Airways stock fluctuated wildly as markets processed the implications. Civil rights organizations praised the decision, while conservative business publications warned of woke capitalism gone mad. In the aftermath, David and Jack faced their biggest challenge yet, examining every level of the company for the subtle discriminatory practices Whitaker had institutionalized. The task seemed overwhelming, but they had momentum now, and more importantly, they had proof that change was possible. As they left the boardroom, David paused. You know this isn't over, right? Whitaker has friends in the industry. They'll push back hard. Jack nodded, remembering his own journey from resistance to understanding. Let them push. We'll push harder. The victory over Whitaker had barely settled when the anonymous email arrived at every major news outlet. Jack Miller's hidden past, the truth about Atlantic Airways reform champion. Attached were security footage and incident reports from 5 years ago, showing Jack participating in an aggressive removal of another minority passenger. The revelation exploded across social media. Miller Exposed trended alongside clips comparing the two incidents. Critics called it proof that the entire reform program was a publicity stunt. Even supporters of the changes felt betrayed. David sat in his office, watching the footage with Jack. The similarities were undeniable. The same aggressive posture, the same assumptions, the same disregard for dignity. Why didn't you tell me? David asked quietly. Jack's hands were shaking. I convinced myself it was different. That time, the passenger had actually violated a policy. I told myself I was just doing my job. He paused, struggling with the words. But watching it now, I can see I enjoyed the power. I was just as wrong then as I was with you. The press demanded statements. Civil rights organizations withdrew their support. Employees were divided, with some calling for Jack's resignation, while others defended his transformation as proof that real change was possible. David called an emergency press conference. Jack tried to resign that morning, but David refused to accept it. Running away isn't accountability, he said. Face it, own it. Show them what real change looks like. The conference room was packed, cameras rolling as David approached the podium. Jack stood to the side, visibly pale but standing straight. 5 years ago, David began, Jack Miller participated in an act of discrimination. 3 months ago, he did it again. To me. The easy response would be to fire him, denounce him, use him as an example of why people don't change. He paused, looking directly into the cameras. But that would be a lie. Jack stepped forward at David's gesture, facing the hostile crowd. I'm not here to make excuses. What you saw in that video was who I was. Not just on those 2 days, but every day. The difference is, now I see it. Now I understand what I was really doing and why it was wrong. A reporter stood. How can anyone trust your conversion when you hid this incident? They shouldn't, Jack replied, his voice steady despite his trembling hands. Trust has to be earned. Not through words, but through actions, through continuing to face uncomfortable truths and doing the hard work of change. David returned to the podium. When I first met Jack Miller, he was the face of discrimination at Atlantic Airways. Today, he's the face of transformation. Not because he's perfect, but because he's proof that people can change when they're willing to confront their mistakes and do the work to fix them. He gestured to a screen behind him, which displayed statistics from their reform program. In 3 months, we've reduced discriminatory incidents by 60%. Employee diversity has increased across all levels. Customer satisfaction is at an all-time high. This isn't despite Jack's past. It's because of it. He knows exactly what needs to change because he's lived both sides of this story. The room fell silent as David concluded. The question isn't whether people can change. The question is whether we're willing to allow them to. Whether we're willing to do the hard work of transforming our companies, our institutions, and ourselves into something better. The press conference ended with an unprecedented announcement. Atlantic Airways would establish a truth and reconciliation program, encouraging employees to come forward with past incidents and participate in creating solutions. Jack would lead the program, using his own story as a template for transformation. As cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, David and Jack stood together at the podium, no longer just owner and employee, but partners in a revolution that extended far beyond one airline or one incident. They had shown that real change was possible, not despite their failures, but because of their willingness to face them honestly and work tirelessly to do better. The story of Atlantic Airways became more than a viral video or a corporate scandal. It became a blueprint for how institutions could acknowledge their faults, confront their biases, and transform themselves into forces for positive change.